All right, so we're back and ready to really dig into some fascinating stuff happening right now, mid-March 2025. We're talking about the economy, we're talking about politics.
Yeah, a lot going on.
A lot going on, and we've got these reports that we're diving into, trying to figure out, what's going on with inflation, what are people actually feeling about the economy, what is the Trump administration doing, and what does it mean for us, for everyone listening?
Absolutely. So we'll try to sort of connect all those dots.
Exactly. Connect the dots, get rid of the jargon,
Right.
make it clear.
And just tell you what's important.
Exactly.
Right now.
And so let's start with this economic picture. So I've got the February inflation numbers. We've got the CPI, the Consumer Price Index,
Yeah.
and the PPI, the Producer Price Index. And both of them were lower than expected.
Right.
Which, on the surface, that sounds good.
Sounds good.
So let's unpack that a little bit.
All right. So the CPI, the headline number, which includes everything, rose by just 0.2% for the month.
So not a big jump. And then 2.8% year over year. And that was actually lower than economists were predicting.
Oh, yeah.
Energy prices played a big role in that, actually. Gasoline was down 4.7%.
Wow.
And we also saw some easing in food prices.
Okay, so it sounds like a pretty broad-based decline. And it wasn't just the overall CPI, right?
That's right.
Because there's also the core CPI.
Exactly.
Which takes out those more volatile things like food and energy costs, and that also came in lower than expected.
It did, 0.2% month over month and 3.1% year over year. And again, transportation services played a big role in that. Airline tickets were actually down 4%.
Okay.
And shelter inflation, so this is a big part of the core CTI. This is your housing costs.
Sure.
That had its lowest year-over-year increase since late 2021. So that suggests that maybe things are starting to cool off in the housing sector.
Okay, interesting. Now, the PPI, that tells a slightly different story, right?
Yeah.
It was flat month over month for February, but it's still up 3.2% from a year ago.
Right.
So what should we be taking away from that? Well, the PPI looks at prices that domestic producers are getting.
Okay.
And the February data showed, yes, energy prices were declining, same as the CPI. But food prices actually rose quite a bit.
Oh, interesting.
1.7%. And here's what's really interesting, is that almost half of that increase came from egg prices.
Eggs, huh? So you've got to talk about eggs. That's a very specific item to call out. And it's a little strange because just like a week later, we got news that wholesale egg prices had actually plummeted.
Yeah.
Like they went from, over $8 a dozen down to like a little over $4 a dozen in like a matter of 2 weeks.
Wild.
It's crazy. And then plus there's that whole, Justice Department investigation into those earlier price hikes.
Right.
So what's going on with eggs?
Well, it shows you that sometimes you have to look at the timing of things. And, the market can change very quickly.
Of course. Yeah.
And so the February PPI data, that captured that surge.
Right.
That early surge. But then prices dropped very quickly after that. And then you have this DOJ investigation, which suggests that maybe something fishy was going on.
Yeah.
Maybe it was temporary. Maybe it was manipulation. We don't know. But it just shows you that, economic data is a snapshot.
It is.
It's a snapshot in time.
It is.
And you can have these wild swings, and it's hard to really, make sense of everything sometimes.
It really is, especially when you've got eggs involved. But okay, so we have this inflation picture, right? And it seems like, things are at least, moderating a little bit. But then, we also got that University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index, and that really tanked in March.
Yeah.
It hit its lowest point since 2022.
Right.
And that just seems counterintuitive. Inflation is easing, but people are feeling worse.
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive, but this is actually pretty common. Economic data, it often lags behind how people are feeling.
Right.
And so even if the numbers look better on paper, if people are stressed, they're worried about their jobs, they're worried about the economy as a whole, then that's going to weigh more heavily than those numbers.
Right.
And what was really interesting in this survey is that people's expectations for inflation over the next 5 years, that actually went up to a 1993 high.
Wow.
3.9%. So even though we're seeing some moderation now, there's still a lot of concern that inflation is going to stick around.
So they're thinking, yeah, maybe things are a little bit better now.
Right.
But they're not really seeing it getting much better over the next few years.
Right, exactly. It's not a blip, they think.
Yeah. And it wasn't just about inflation expectations, right?
No.
Because the survey also pointed to concerns about jobs and personal finances.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people are getting more uncertain about what's going to happen with jobs in the future, and they're getting nervous about their own money situation.
Sure.
And this is important because, consumer sentiment, how people are feeling about the future. That's a big predictor of what they're actually going to do.
Right.
And so if they're worried about their jobs, if they're worried about making ends meet, they're more likely to cut back on spending.
And that makes sense. If you're not feeling secure about your job or your finances, you're not going to be as free with spending.
Right.
But, it's interesting because we also got that JOLTS report, the job openings and labor turnover report, and that showed that the job market was still really strong.
Yeah.
In January, job openings actually exceeded expectations.
Exactly. So you have this strong labor market, which is good.
Yeah.
But then you have these really pessimistic consumers.
Right.
So it's a mixed bag.
It is a mixed bag. So what are we supposed to make of all of this?
Well, it could be that we're in for a bit of a slowdown.
Yeah.
If consumers cut back on spending, that's going to have an effect on growth.
Right.
And there's another factor, and this is important. The inflation numbers we've been talking about, those don't reflect the tariffs that have recently gone into effect. Yeah. And, those tariffs, they can really push prices up.
Sure.
So we got to keep an eye on that.
Definitely. So we've got to watch how all of this plays out,
Yeah.
These different factors all interacting. So what are some of the other economic things that we should be paying attention to in the coming weeks and months?
This week, the big things are going to be the February retail sales report. That's going to tell us if those pessimistic consumers are actually, buying less stuff.
Right.
And then we've got the latest housing data.
Okay.
Which is going to tell us, how that market is doing. And then, of course, the Federal Reserve is going to be making an interest rate decision.
Right.
And most people think they're going to hold steady.
Okay.
Given this kind of mixed bag of data that we've been talking about.
That makes sense.
But it's important to remember, even if they hold steady, rates are still high.
Yeah, they are.
And that means that borrowing costs are still elevated. So that makes it more expensive to buy a car, more expensive to buy a house.
Exactly. So we'll see how that plays out in the housing data this week.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's switch gears and look at what happened in the financial markets last week. Investors weren't exactly doing cartwheels over all this, were they?
No, not really. They were pretty spooked, actually.
Right.
All the major U.S. stock indexes finished the week in the red.
Okay.
The S&P 500, the NASDAQ, the Dow, all down. The S&P 500 even dipped into what we call correction territory.
Okay.
Which means it was down more than 10% from its recent peak.
Right.
So that tells you that investors are getting worried. They're kind of reassessing things.
Right.
And they're probably expecting some more volatility down the road.
So pretty widespread declines. Was there any variation in different parts of the market?
Small caps actually did the best out of the domestic stocks.
Okay.
But they were still down.
Okay.
Mid caps, they were down too.
All right, and how about those international markets?
So international developed markets, they also finished the week in the red, but they actually outperformed U.S. equities. And the emerging markets, those were down a little bit less. So there was a global pullback.
Yeah.
But it played out a little bit differently.
A little bit differently in different regions.
Yeah.
Okay, and last but not least, what happened in the fixed income markets? The bond market.
Yeah, so bond yields stayed pretty much the same. And most fixed income indices were also down.
Okay.
The U.S. aggregate bond index, that saw the smallest decline.
Okay.
But the high yield corporate bond index, that was down more.
Okay, interesting. So overall, kind of a down week, reflecting all that uncertainty we were talking about earlier. But let's shift gears now. Let's go to politics. President Trump did sign that government funding bill, so at least we've avoided a shutdown for now.
Yeah, that's right. So we're good through September.
Okay.
Spending levels are pretty much the same as they were during the previous administration.
Okay.
There were a couple tweaks. Non-defense spending is...
Okay. All right. But the report that we have here also talks about these increasing tensions with the judiciary. It even says that the judiciary is the last remaining check on presidential power. That's a pretty bold statement.
It is.
So what's going on there?
Well, you've got some judges pushing back against the administration.
Okay.
Judge Tanya Chutkan, for example. She blocked the EPA from canceling billions of dollars in climate grants.
Oh, wow.
Those were part of the Inflation Reduction Act. And her argument was that once Congress allocates money, the executive branch is supposed to spend it the way Congress said.
Okay, yeah.
So she's basically saying, hey, separation of powers.
Right.
You got to respect that.
Yeah, that's pretty fundamental to how our system works.
Yeah.
What were some of the other examples of judges challenging the administration?
Well, you've got Judge Jesse Furman.
Okay.
He granted an appeal in the case of Mahmoud Khalil.
Okay.
This is a green card holder who hasn't actually been charged with a crime, but the administration wanted to deport him. So Judge Furman said, nope, not going to happen. He allowed the appeal to go forward. He rejected the Justice Department's request to move the case to a different court. And he said, look, Mr. Khalil can't be deported while this is going on.
Right.
And the article makes the argument that this case might be a way to get the Supreme Court to weigh in on whether green card holders can be deported for exercising their First Amendment rights.
Wow, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
Especially for people who are legal residents here.
Absolutely. Big questions about what rights and protections they have.
Exactly, yeah.
And then there's the case of Judge James Boasberg. He stopped the deportation of some alleged Venezuelan gang members.
Okay.
And this actually led to President Trump calling for his impeachment.
Wow.
But the article makes a point. It's not about defending gang members.
Right.
It's about due process.
Sure.
Everybody has the right to due process. Even Chief Justice John Roberts weighed in on this, said judges can't just be impeached because the president doesn't like their rulings.
Well, yeah. And it's the judiciary's job to make sure that everybody gets a fair shake in court.
Exactly.
It sounds like the administration isn't really happy about these judges pushing back. In fact, we've even heard border czar Tom Homan saying, basically, I don't care what the judges say.
Yeah.
It's not going to stop us. That's a pretty strong statement.
It is. He's basically saying that the president is above the law.
Wow.
That, the law is just a tool for the president to use against his enemies.
Mm-hmm.
And, the author of this article, they see that as a real threat to our constitutional system.
Yeah, I mean, that really goes against everything that we, stand for as a country.
Yeah.
So all of this tension between the president and the judges, that's got to be causing some division within the Republican Party itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
What are we seeing there?
So the article basically says a lot of Republicans in Congress, they're really worried about what President Trump's doing.
Mm-hmm.
They're worried about, the rule of law, democracy, all that.
Yeah.
But they're scared to say anything.
Okay, yeah.
They're worried that President Trump will, back a primary challenger against them.
Sure.
But then you've got some House Republicans, like Representative Brandon Gill. He's actually introduced a resolution to impeach Judge Boasberg.
Wow.
So they're trying to be, really closely aligned with President Trump. But then, on the other side, you've got Republican senators like John Kennedy and John Cornyn. They've said they're not on board with impeaching judges just because they disagree with their rulings.
Right.
Kennedy even called it idiotic.
Oh, okay. So, it sounds like there's this real struggle within the Republican Party,
Right.
Loyalty to Trump versus, defending the rule of law.
Exactly.
It's tough. And, meanwhile, President Trump is really focused on reshaping the judiciary for the long term. What's his strategy there?
So it seems like he's learned from his first term. He's realizing that personal loyalty trumps, no pun intended.
Right.
It trumps legal philosophy.
Right.
When it comes to appointing judges. So he's trying to fill the courts with people who are going to back him up.
Right.
No matter what.
Okay.
Mike Davis, he was counsel on the Senate Judiciary Committee, he said they're looking for even more bold and fearless judges.
What does that even mean?
Judges who are willing to push the limits, even break the rules.
Wow.
To get what the president wants.
Okay. And we're already hearing some names being floated as potential Supreme Court nominees. What can you tell us about those?
Aileen Cannon, Catherine Kimball, Mizell, they're both federal judges in Florida.
Right.
Trump appointed them. Mizell's the one who struck down the federal mask mandate for travel during COVID.
Right.
And Senator Blumenthal, he's a Democrat on the Senate Judiciary Committee. He thinks Trump's future nominees are going to be even more ideologically extreme.
Okay.
And he thinks they might even try to change the Senate rules.
Okay.
To make it easier to confirm them.
Yeah.
So, we got to watch this closely. This could really change the judiciary for a long time.
It sounds like it. And it's not just about the judges themselves, right? I mean, there are reports about the administration being really hostile towards lawyers and law firms that have gone up against them in the past.
That's right.
So what's going on with that?
There's a lot of fear in the legal profession right now,
Okay.
especially for firms that have opposed Trump.
Okay.
People are worried about retaliation.
Sure.
The word is that the administration is very punitive.
Okay.
They like to get revenge. And there was even an anonymous letter from young associates
Okay.
at some big law firms. And they condemned some of the administration's actions. So there's a lot of unease in the legal community right now.
Yeah, and it sounds like it could really discourage lawyers from taking on cases or challenging the administration, which is, not good for anybody. All right, so let's switch to another sensitive topic, Social Security. This report suggests that there are some changes happening that could really hurt people's benefits. And, it sounds like this is being driven by, people in the administration, maybe even Elon Musk, wanting to cut Social Security.
Yeah.
So what's going on there?
So it's not like they're trying to get rid of Social Security all at once.
Right.
It's more like death by 1,000 cuts.
Okay.
They're making all these little changes that make it harder to get benefits.
Right.
And the thing is, this isn't just theoretical. It's already happening.
Okay.
We've already seen a bunch of Social Security offices closed across the country.
Right.
Places like Arkansas, Florida, Kentucky, Louisiana, North Carolina, Texas.
Okay.
They've been hit especially hard.
Wow.
And that means that people have to travel farther. They have to wait longer. It's just a pain.
And that's going to be even harder now because they're also changing how people can interact with the SSA, right?
That's right. They're getting rid of the phone lines for all these basic tasks.
Oh.
Like signing up for benefits, changing your address, updating your marital status, all that stuff.
Okay.
They want you to do it online now.
So if you don't have a computer or you're not good with computers.
Or you don't have internet access.
Right.
Your only option is to go to an office.
And they've just closed a bunch of offices.
Exactly.
That doesn't seem good.
And it's going to hit the elderly, people with disabilities, people in rural areas. Those folks are going to have a really tough time.
Right.
Senator Gillibrand, she called this a full-blown attack on Social Security.
Yeah, and it does seem like they're making it as hard as possible for people to get the benefits that they're entitled to. Yeah. So let's talk about campaign finances.
Okay.
Because we're hearing that President Trump has built up this huge war chest of campaign funds.
Mm-hmm.
What's he planning to do with all that money, especially since he can't run for president again?
That's the big question.
Yeah.
A lot of Republicans in Congress are hoping that he's going to use it to help them keep control of the House and the Senate in 2026.
Okay.
So he could give a lot of it to super PACs.
Right.
Those are those groups that can spend unlimited amounts of money to support or oppose candidates.
Right.
But the thing is, those super PACs, they might not always agree with Trump on who to support.
Right, because they're looking at, who can win the general election.
Exactly.
Not just who Trump likes.
Exactly. And then, Trump might want to keep some of that money for himself.
Okay.
To support his allies.
Right.
Maybe even attack his enemies.
Yeah.
Even if they're Republicans.
Yeah.
He still hasn't forgiven Thomas Massie.
Right. He holds a grudge. So, yeah, having all that money gives him a lot of power.
Yeah.
People are going to think twice before they cross him. We also saw that J.D. Vance is now the RNC finance chair.
Right.
What does that mean for this whole financial picture?
So he's basically in charge of the RNC's money.
Okay.
So if you're a member of Congress, you're running for re-election, and you need money.
Right.
You're going to want to stay on Vance's good side.
Right.
And that means, staying on Trump's good side.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk about Kari Lake and the Voice of America.
Okay.
Because it seems like her plans to take over there have hit a snag.
Yeah.
So what's the latest?
So she was supposed to be the new director, but then Trump basically shut down the whole U.S. Agency for Global Media, which runs the VOA.
Wow.
1,000 journalists and staff, all on administrative leave.
Wow.
They're not putting out any news anymore. And this is a big deal. The VOA, they provide news and information to people in countries where there isn't a free press.
Right, like Russia and China.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So this is a big blow to those efforts.
So where does Kari Lake fit into all this?
Well, she hasn't been officially appointed as director,
Okay.
but she is serving as an advisor. And there's this interesting connection to Project 2025.
Okay, yeah.
This is that big conservative agenda for the future.
Right.
And one of their goals was to either put the VOA under the president's control,
Okay.
or just shut it down altogether.
Yeah.
And the lawyer who's working with Lake now, he actually wrote about that.
Wow.
So it's interesting that she's now involved with this, apparent dismantling of the VOA.
It is interesting, yeah. Okay, so we've talked about all this activity, President Trump making moves.
Yeah.
But we're also seeing reports that his approval ratings are going down.
Yeah.
What's up with that?
So Kristen Saltis Anderson, she's a Republican pollster.
Okay.
She's been looking at this, and she thinks that maybe Trump is misreading his mandate.
What does that mean?
So her analysis suggests that when people voted for Trump, their main concern was the economy.
Sure.
Inflation, cost of living, all that stuff. They wanted that to get better.
Okay.
But she thinks Trump might be interpreting that as a mandate for a broader disruption.
Okay.
Like, he thinks people want him to shake things up, to be bold, even if it's unpopular. And she thinks he's wrong.
Okay.
She's worried that he's going to focus too much on these big controversial things like tariffs.
Right.
And he's going to neglect the economy.
Right.
And she thinks that's going to hurt him in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, that's a classic mistake that politicians make. They think they have a mandate for something when they really don't.
Right.
So we'll see how that plays out. Speaking of the future, we're also hearing that J.D. Vance is being talked about as a potential frontrunner for the 2028 Republican nomination.
Yeah, he's really risen fast.
Yeah, that's fast.
And it's because he's so loyal to Trump.
Okay.
He's always been in Trump's corner.
Right.
And he really shares Trump's worldview.
Okay.
He even won the CPAC straw poll for the next Republican nominee.
Wow.
And Donald Trump Jr. is apparently a big fan.
Mm-hmm.
But the question is, can he appeal to more than just the Trump base?
Right, because that's not going to be enough to win a general election.
Right, exactly. And he's a bit more intellectual,
Okay.
more academic than Trump.
Okay.
So it's not clear if he can connect with those blue-collar voters who were so important to Trump's victory.
Right. Okay, so a couple more things to cover. Canada is apparently thinking about not buying those F-35 fighter jets.
Yeah.
What's going on there?
Well, they're not too happy about how close the U.S. is getting to certain other countries.
Okay.
So they're thinking about buying European jets instead,
Okay.
which would be a pretty big snub to the U.S.
Yeah, it would. And, one last thing, looking ahead to the 2026 midterms.
Yeah.
Both the Democrats and the Republicans have put out their lists of House races that they're targeting, and there's a lot of overlap.
Yeah.
They're both focused on those districts that flipped in the last election.
Right.
So Democrats who won in districts that Trump carried and Republicans who won in districts that Harris carried.
Yeah.
So those incumbents are going to have to fight really hard to keep their seats.
Oh, yeah. Those races are going to be brutal.
So as we wrap this up, we're looking at a really complicated picture, right? The economy is kind of a mixed bag, and consumers aren't feeling great about the future. And then you have all this political stuff going on, challenges to the courts, potential changes to Social Security,
Right.
and a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen in the next election.
Right. Yeah. It's a lot to process. I think the key takeaway here is that there's a real disconnect between what the economic data is saying, which is maybe things are getting a little bit better, and how people are actually feeling, which is, not good.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you've got this conflict between the president and, the rest of the government, the courts, Congress.
It's a mess. It is a mess.
Wow.
So with all that said, what do you think is the most important thing for people to keep an eye on in the coming months? And what do you think all of this means for the future of the country?
That's a great question. And, it's a really tough one to answer. But I think, the thing to watch is whether this disconnect between the data and how people are feeling, whether that starts to translate into real economic problems.
Yeah.
If people keep cutting back on spending, that could lead to a recession. And then on the political side, I think the big question is, can our institutions hold up under this pressure?
Right.
Trump's really testing the limits of presidential power, and it's not clear how this is all going to shake out.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder what's going to happen next and how all of this is going to affect us all.